There is no consensus among scientists about the exact reason that an individual develops a heterosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian orientation. Although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social, and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by a particular factor or factors. Many think that nature and nurture both play complex roles. Most people experience little or no sense of choice about their sexual orientation. This presentation will discuss and state research that has been done to determine whether sexuality is biological or psychological.
There has been a lot of research done in the area of the biological side of homosexuality. One of those researchers was Simon LeVay. He is a renowned British-American neuroscientist who is best known for his research on brain structures in the hypothalamus. It was in the early 90s that LeVay published the statement that there is a difference in the hypothalamic structure between heterosexual and homosexual men. LeVay thought it was important to emphasize to the public that they should not misinterpret the findings of his research study in the wrong way. He found a difference in the structure of the hypothalamus and not prove that homosexuality was genetic. His finding, however, did show that there is a biological difference between homosexual and heterosexual men. The main finding of LeVay's research was that the hypothalamus in homosexual men was different from that of a heterosexual male. In an article that LeVay wrote along with a researcher with the last name Hamer, they described 3 different possibilities as to why the hypothalamus in homosexual men is different. The 3 possibilities were that the structural differences were present in early life and helped establish the men's sexual orientation. The second option is that the differences arose in adult life as a result of the men's sexual feelings or behavior. The third reason is that there is no causal connection, but both sexual orientation and the brain structures in question are linked to some third variable, such as a developmental event in their life. LeVay stated, though, that he favors the first possibility, that the structural differences arose during the period of brain development and consequently contributed to sexual behavior. Another researcher was named Schwab. He announced 5 years later that a cluster of cells in the human brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus was dimorphic, but dimorphic according to sexual orientation rather than sex. Schwab found that the suprachiasmatic nucleus was nearly twice as large in homosexual men as it was in heterosexual men. This makes his research very similar to LeVay's research. According to Schwab, he too had the opportunity to study the structure of the hypothalamus. He stated that they investigated 34 subjects, 18 males from 22 to 74 years of age, the sexual orientation of whom was generally not known. They served as a comparison group. The homosexual male group consisted of 10 non-demented AIDS subjects aged 25 to 43. 6 heterosexuals, 4 males, 2 females, aged 21 to 73 years, who had also died of AIDS, served as a control group. They studied the 2 areas of the hypothalamus, called the SCN and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. They found that the cell numbers in the SCN of the reference group, the male homosexuals and the heterosexual men, was 1.7 times as large as that of the reference group of male subjects, and contained 2.1 times as many cells. This means that the hypothalamus in the brain was indeed larger. LeVay and Schwab both show that there is an anatomical or biological difference between homosexuals and heterosexuals. The most interesting question here, after finding this research, is not whether genetics or biology plays a role in homosexuality, but how it plays a role.
Alright, and this is Nicholas Brown coming at you with some biological arguments toward the cause of homosexuality in a human's life. And to kick things off, just kind of a statement to begin with of the fact of how humans are a little different than your typical wild animal. They have a very social, very well-established social structure, and this social structure allowed them to achieve great things. Now, as homosexuality has been observed in different species in nature, I would also note that those species tend to be rather social as well. So something that could kind of go along with the success of various social species. Another interesting study that I happened to stumble across was one done by a pair of literature study folks, Campiero and Stiani. And what they looked at was a pedigree analysis, or, so to speak, kind of a family tree sort of thing to sort of track homosexuality through certain family lines. And one of the things that they noticed was that there was statistical data that showed that the chances of being homosexual, supposedly in male child, would increase each time there was a male child born before that. So, therefore, as more males would be born from the same mother, as she would continue to have those males, the ones that she had most recently would be the ones which would have the chance of more likely ending up to be homosexual. Okay, and on the third slide, we go ahead and show you kind of why, or at least a proposed theory as to the likelihood of a male being more homosexual based on how many brothers were born before him. It's thought that perhaps the presence of the male's fetus inside of the female's womb causes sort of an immune reaction which sets the womb up to behaving physiologically in a little different manner. And this effect gets intensified with each male birth. And the effects of the womb on the developing fetus would be that of perhaps, different amounts of hormones that would be present, different temperatures of the womb, different pH, a variety of biological or chemical factors that could go into have an effect on this developing fetus. When one thinks about a family structure or a social structure within, a smaller community, it almost begins to make sense that the more males that would be present in a social setting, that the further down the line, perhaps the female's biology would tend to produce a homosexual male, which could potentially benefit, the tribe or the society of the small group, and the fact that to help to increase fitness in regards to hunting and gathering, as well as not being in competition for a mate, which would kind of bolster the biological argument as to, why would human biology preserve such a gene. Seems like a plausible explanation, for me at least. Alright, and on my fifth slide, theory that comes up that also interests me is something that would kind of be dubbed as the neuroendocrine theory. Now, neuro, of course, referring to the nervous system, mainly the brain. The endocrine referring to hormones, the active chemicals that get certain cells in the body going. And how those two would intermingle to create behavior. And a theory that comes up with a study that was conducted by Savin and Williams was that a lot of the behaviors associated with homosexuality would be due to slight differences in their neural anatomy of their brain, which those differences in neural anatomy may have a vast impact or a dynamic impact on how certain hormones are released, when hormones are released at specific times, as well as the amounts of the hormones that are released. Could all have a drastic effect on the mental and physical development of a man or a woman. And on the sixth slide, to continue the neuroendocrine theory discussion, biologists oftentimes point out this so-called atypical behavior, or a certain type of pre-programming, if you will, that would be the underlying cause of certain behaviors that would be associated with homosexuality. And in some way, the person's neural structure or neural anatomy would be altered by genetic factors, or perhaps in utero developmental factors that could possibly influence their development, which, as mentioned previously, may profoundly impact their body's physiology in relation to hormones. So kind of how the anatomy would affect the physiology. And this brings out a lot of the typical homosexual behavior that I guess in this research has been considered atypical, and that this atypical behavior would strongly caused by this person's biological predisposition. And for my seventh and final slide for my portion of defending the biological reasoning behind homosexuality, I found it to be necessary to include a statement that I found in Savin and Williams' study that was actually just citing another statement that had come up in a biologist study over homosexuality and its ties with biology. And that was from a study done by Bailey and Zucker, in which they had looked to show that when bringing up homosexuality and its potential causes or roots and anything that was noticed with a particular child who would end up being homosexual, that one of the most profound bits that is shown in literature across the board involving homosexuality and psychology is that this atypical behavior and homosexuality really just go hand in hand. So biologists would argue that this atypical behavior, which seems to go hand in hand with homosexuality, would be biologically predetermined.
Now more than ever, it has been seen that homosexuality has biological entities, and these facts cannot be denied. An example of this is the fraternal brother order. This theory was first studied by Ray Blanchard, who saw an association between the probabilities for a male to be homosexual based on how many older brothers he had. Blanchard believed that each older brother a male has, his chance of being gay increases by 1/3 to 1/2. It is thought that this is due to a mother building up an antibody against an unknown protein. Another study done by Martin Cohn and Hang Zhang, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, but this depicts a correlation between the finger length ratio and homosexuality. The study shows that the ratio of the index finger and the fourth finger can determine homosexuality. The fourth finger tends to be higher in female than in males. This ratio is lower in homosexuals than in heterosexuals of the same sex. The final study I examined was performed by Dennis McFadden. The study was regarding autoacoustic emissions, or OAEs. McFadden's study speaks of autoacoustic emissions that are emitted by a person's cochlea in response to a noise. Male and female ears have different OAEs, as well as a right and a left ear. These findings showed that gay males have slightly different OAEs than heterosexual males. McFadden emphasizes that these effects cannot be used as an indicator for sexual orientation in individuals, but the findings suggest that OAEs deserve consideration for further development.
Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis. He put forward sexual theories, including his thoughts on the origins and meanings of homosexuality. He alluded to homosexuality numerous times in his writings and concluded that paranoia and homosexuality were inseparable. Psychoanalytic scholar Kenneth Lewes argued that Freud actually had 4 theories of homosexuality. The first was that it arises out of an outcome of the Oedipus complex and the boy's discovery that his mother is castrated. The second, Freud developed the theory that the future homosexual child is so over-attracted to his mother that he identifies with her and narcissistically seeks love objects like himself so that he can love them like his mother loved them. The third, if a negative or inverted Oedipus complex occurred, the boy would seek his father's love and a masculine identification by taking on a feminine identification and reverting to anal eroticism. Fourth, and finally, homosexuality could be a result from the reaction formation. A sadistic jealousy of brothers and fathers is safely converted into love for other men. In 1962, Irving Bieber and his colleagues published a study. Their work was particularly influential in the portrayal of a pathogenic family type that presumably led to homosexuality in 106 adult homosexual men that they studied. Bieber and his colleagues claimed a 27% cure rate of the patients in their study. Early studies of homosexuality within the medical and psychoanalytical fields led to similar outcomes. The removal of responsibility for defining homosexuality from the realms of morality and religion, and securing it within science and medicine. The creation of a category of person who stood in contrast to the moral and religious beliefs that homosexuality was a behavior rather than a source of identity. The perpetuation of homosexuality's social stigma by taking it out of the realm of sin and immortality and placing it within the realm of pathology and immaturity. However, these developments would eventually set the stage for the normalization of homosexuality that began to occur in the mid-20th century.
Many people believed that homosexuality was actually a mental disorder. The American Psychological Association has worked hard since 1975 to change people's thinking and help them better understand homosexuality. To help us understand a bit more about homosexuality, we should first discuss what sexual orientation is and means. Sexual orientation is the pattern of one's emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attraction to those of either the same or opposite sex. Based on these attractions and feelings, sexual orientation refers to the sense of identity to those who share those attractions. Sexual orientation is often categorized as heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Each culture labels sexual orientation to those who share attractions differently. In the United States, we label each orientation as lesbian, women attracted to other women, gay, men attracted to other men, or bisexual, men or women attracted to both sexes. The American Psychological Association goes on to state, people express their sexual orientation through behaviors with others, including such simple actions as holding hands or kissing. Thus, sexual orientation is closely tied to the intimate, personal relationships that meet deeply felt needs for love, attachment, and intimacy. A question that often comes up when talking about homosexuality is how do people know? People who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual have to recognize how they feel. Most people start to have strong feelings when they enter the middle of their childhood or early adolescence. These urges and feelings often happen without having any sexual contact prior. Some people engage in sexual contact with same-sex or opposite-sex partners before labeling themselves with a sexual orientation. At times it is difficult to express or state your sexual orientation due to a sense of discrimination. Much research has been done to prove that homosexuality is determined by your genes or through biology. Despite this research, it cannot be conclusive that biology solely plays the role. Even the American Psychological Association believes that it is a variety of many factors, adding to the nature versus nurture argument. We must remember that many of these contributions to sexual orientation start with our emotions, romantic and sexual attractions. It all boils down to how we feel.
And finally, the conclusion of this great psychological debate: homosexuality, biological or psychological? To begin the conclusion phase, we have a face-off between our issues where we state the biological side versus the psychological side, bringing up various points that were found previously in the presentation. Without kind of just reading these things verbatim, I will just kind of briefly bring up some ideas here. A thing you'll see throughout the biological argument is pointing out different anatomical structures that are existing in their bodies. For instance, the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, different inner ear structures, and that these different structures could tie the biological factors in of kind of relating how, either their presence would create different hormonal effects, or if perhaps different hormonal effects would have created them. Either way, this shows a biological change in the body of an anatomical or provable manner, which could kind of argue to the side of the physiological changes of the different amounts of hormones that would come out. Other factors being the behaviors displayed by homosexuals, that their atypical behavior, which maybe leads them or shows their predisposition to homosexuality, is something that would be generated by biology. Another interesting fact of looking at family bloodlines, such as their pedigree charts and such, would show that increased chances of homosexuality after the number of male births from the same mother. That could be possibly due to different immune reactions to the male fetus inside the female's womb. Which then, of course, would have different changes on the developing fetus later on down the line. That, along with the whole if your index finger is longer than your ring finger study, which is kind of interesting. I did this with anatomy kids once. Of course, I didn't force them to do it. They wanted to see. And from what I remember, if it was the ring finger being longer, that would point to the fact on men that you would be heterosexual. If it was the index finger on a man, that would point to the fact that you could possibly be homosexual. Of course, it would be a tough call to be able to point out somebody's homosexuality based on that, and you'd probably piss them off a little bit. All right, moving over to the psychological side. Freud considered homosexuality to be something in the mind which could be similar to paranoia, or perhaps a delusion created in there. Also, studies show that this may be an Oedipus conflict, having to do with, ties with their mother and perhaps needed attention from their father. Also, there's possibly recreative settings where Beaver showed that homosexuality could almost be created based on the structures that were observed in various homosexual men. Also, as the Psychological Society has decided to deem homosexuality as an identity rather than a behavior. Also, the American Psychological Association considered homosexuality, which was once a mental illness, which has now been revised. The APA also believes that the research of biology hasn't really been conclusive despite massive attempts to show that homosexuality is biological, thus kind of perhaps even bolstering the nature versus nurture argument on psychological, stating that nurture does have quite a bit to do with that. And finally, the last of the conclusion to the conclusion. Of a variety of theories that has come up in this, and looking at both sides, I've always made it a point to try to not be biased and try to look at things from both sides, because of course we can all think of times where perhaps our side wasn't seen in an argument. And I really do enjoy reading about theories that take into concept every single aspect of a person's life. Some psychological theorists would simply denote the fact of how they were brought up, while other psychological theorists would say that it was mostly genetic, or hormonally driven. I like to look at every possible angle, and I guess as I state here, it would be presumptuous of us to think that just biology or just psychology would be the sole cause of a condition such as homosexuality, or should I state an identity such as homosexuality. I think you could probably imagine a variety of circumstances, and that perhaps maybe somebody's biological influences on their body did drive them towards being homosexual. Perhaps an a overly masculine woman or a rather feminine man. But then also we could probably think of times where you'll have a very masculine man who perhaps due to certain occurrences in his life has decided to go the homosexual route and would prefer it to be that way. So one way or another, you really can't necessarily say it's just one way or another, as in most cases with everything in life, there's a variety of factors involved. So this is Nick Brown signing out for the conclusion of our debate of homosexuality, whether it be psychological or biological. Thanks for tuning in.